All right. Good afternoon, good evening, and also good morning. Welcome to our first event of the Sinophone Studies New Book Series. This monthly series introduces recent publication about Sinophone studies, and our theme for fall 2021 is Oceanic Connection. I'm Li-Ping Chen. I'm a postdoctoral scholar and also teaching fellow here in EASC. So today we will be take a look at Keelung, a port city in Taiwan. And then in October, we will sail all the way to the Atlantic. And then in November, we will encounter pirates, literature about pirates. So ocean. You can find more information on our event page, and I will share the link in the chat box later. I wanted to thank Sonia and Grace for their great support for the series, and also Alex and the wonderful EASC staff for their help. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Evan Dawley here with us to talk about his recent book, Becoming Taiwanese, Ethnogenesis in a Colonial City, 1880s to 1950s. This book was published by Harvard University Press in 2019. He's Associate Professor of History at Goucher College. His research relates to modern East Asian history with particular attention to Taiwan, China, and Japan, as well as identity formation, imperialism, and international transnational history. He has published essays on Japanese settlers in Taiwan and also articles on Taiwanese identity. He is the co-editor of The Decades of the Great War, Japan and the Wider World in the 1910s, and also Beyond Versailles, the 1919 moment in East Asia. So our discussant today is Professor Ping-hui Liao. Professor Liao is Professor of Literary and Critical Studies and Chuan Liu Chair Professor in Taiwan Studies at UCSD. He is an internationally recognized authority in Taiwan studies, specializing in Taiwan cultural history, East-West comparative literature, inter-art studies, popular culture, and critical theory. He has published many works in both English and Chinese. Professor Liao is also the co-editor of Taiwan under Japanese Colonial Rule, 1895 to 1945, History, Culture, Memory. This book was published by Columbia University Press in 2006 and was one of the first English studies of colonial Taiwan. So let me say a little bit about the structure for today's event as well. So today's event will begin with the author's presentation and continue with the discussant comment. And after that, we will move on to the Q&A section. At any points during the talk, feel free to submit your questions to the Q&A box. And if possible, please include information about your affiliation. The Q&A box is located in your Zoom control panel, and there you will also find the closed caption function. Please note that the live transcript is automatically generated by Zoom. So that's all I have to say before we begin this very exciting talk. So without further ado, Professor Dawley.
Thank you very much, Li-Ping, for that very nice introduction and also for organizing all of this and inviting us in the first place. I would also like to thank, of course, the East Asian Studies Center at USC for hosting this talk and this overall series, and everyone who's joined to listen. It's a little strange. This is my first time, I think, on this end of a webinar where I can't see really anybody. But I'm glad that you came. And I finally also, of course, want to thank Professor Liao for agreeing to be the discussant here. I'm quite honored, maybe a little also intimidated because he, of course, has blazed trails in Taiwan studies that I know I've been following. And so I'm excited and maybe a little nervous to hear what he has to say about my work. So without further ado, I've given a number of talks over the years, as we all do, about our books on specific chapters, to illustrate some of the major themes, also on the ways that the project evolved as I turned it from a dissertation into a book. And tonight I want to take a third approach to talking about it, which is to answer the question, what would I, as the author, want people to get out of reading this? Right? What would I want readers to take away? And it's three major themes, if you will. One is a greater awareness and appreciation of Taiwan's everyday history. The second is knowledge of an alternative, non-national version of modern history. And then the third is new frameworks for understanding and using Taiwan's history. As I go through all of these, I'm also going to be explaining a lot about why I wrote the book and its main arguments and some of the contents, but that's how I'm going to organize my comments. So let me begin with this first theme. And I would very much want people to come away from this with a knowledge of Taiwan's Japanese era and early post-war history at the level of everyday life. And this is a really, I think, largely unknown history, or at least it was when I began the project, which is now a couple of decades ago. The books and the articles that I had to work with for quite some time were really great on institutional structures of the Japanese and the early post-war eras, on the identity formation of groups within Taiwanese society, and in particular on the 228 uprising and its effects. And these were all really crucial foundations without which I couldn't have done any of this. And I'm really grateful that I did not have to replicate all of that, was able to build on that. But what we didn't really have so much were local histories that could help us to understand how people lived under Japanese or early KMT colonialism. There's a slight caveat here, of course, which is that for a while, there's been a lot of really detailed anthropological work based on field work done in Taiwan. But a lot of that was very self-consciously about China and not about Taiwan. And as I'll talk in a little while, that was a framework that wasn't all that satisfying for me. And in spite of that, in spite of that anthropological work, I was coming into this project somewhat influenced by the wealth of scholarship on Chinese cities, right? The cottage industry of Shanghai studies, William Rowe's books on Hankou, Kristen Stapleton's on Chengdu, Susan McCann's on Peking. And I wanted people to have that sort of work for Taiwan cities, or at least one city in the end. So to put it maybe a slightly different way, I want people to be able to come away from this book with an appreciation for the textures of everyday life in Taiwan. And so to facilitate that, I provide a rather large quantity of information on local organizations, on temples and religious festivals, on local politics and social and cultural reform efforts, on social welfare activities, and on both native populations and Japanese settlers. And I certainly hope that readers will remember some of the details that were intriguing enough to me to be put into the book. Things like Geelong's cafe waitress competition, which took place in 1933, or the features of temple renovation in the 19-teens and 20s, dueling festival parades in 1934, 35, and 36, the almost street-level activities of social workers in the 20s and 30s, some of the pointed critiques that Geelong city councilors leveled at the KMT appointed mayors in the early days of retrocession, and the fact that residents of Geelong almost completely ignored the messages that were broadcast to them from vans that drove through the city in the mid-1950s, telling them how to observe their ghost festival. They just went about their business. So all right, these and dozens, hundreds of other details, I think provide a depth and a richness to Taiwan's past society that had been missing, I think, from what I had been reading anyway, and without which the depth and the richness of Taiwan's contemporary society doesn't really make full sense, right? It's hard to understand where Taiwan today comes from without knowing all that went on in the past, or slices of all that went on in the past. Now, I should step back and acknowledge that careful readers of the book might note a certain irony with what I've just said, which is that in my efforts to reconstruct a really fine-grained social history of the city at the everyday level, I focused a rather lot of attention on half a dozen men who were anything but ordinary. And I would say to that, yes, I did that partly because they were so significant for most of 50 years that I just could not ignore them, right? I couldn't ignore their important roles, but I have tried to present them as tentpoles, as people that defined and supported the structure of local society and enabled the processes of identity formation within that society that were really at the heart of the book. The last thing I want to say about this theme is that part of the reason for all the detail is perhaps my effort to justify my decision to study Geelong. And that is a little bit of a reaction, I suppose, particularly in the early years of the project. I received a lot of questions about why I had chosen to study Geelong and not a more important city like Taipei or Kaohsiung, or yeah, those were the primary, Tainan, right? Why not study one of those more important places? Well, in an effort maybe to justify that decision, I put so much detail in there because I really want people to know that Geelong was in the vanguard of everything that happened in the first half of the 20th century in Taiwan. And that if they want to understand how Taiwan became what it is, they really need to look at Geelong and what happened there. So I gave them plenty of information to do that. So that's the everyday history. Turning to the second theme, I want readers to understand that this is an alternative to national identity and an alternative to national history. So much of the history of the modern world has been and remains the history of nation states. As a discipline, history is to some extent, I think, still stuck in the 19th century empiricist paradigm in which history was largely defined as the history of the nation. And you know, if we think about how our history departments are structured at institutions of higher learning, they continue to focus on national histories. Most of the lines are in nation-centered histories. Most of the survey courses that we teach are focused on nation states, or even if they're on regions, those regions are built out of single countries. Or sorry, multiple countries and multiple nations. We can think about the jobs that get advertised and how we might lament a decline in China jobs or the conversion of a Japan job into an East Asia line. And those of us here tonight probably particularly lament the absence of Taiwan jobs. But this paradigm has been really quite powerful. And for those who have studied Taiwan as Taiwan, it has been quite influential in the sense that most, although certainly not all, of the scholarship has focused on national questions, right? Questions of Taiwanese independence movements, questions about the origins of Taiwanese nationalism. Now, I certainly do not deny or question the significance of the nation state in modern history. I'm certainly not blind, nor would I want to limit the right of the peoples of Taiwan to build their own nation. But nonetheless, there is a certain teleology to all of this national history. and to a persistent search for the origins of Taiwanese nationalism. And I was also somewhat guided by the sources and the early research that I was doing, right? As I was beginning to learn about actors in Keelung, it seemed to me that they were not evidently living their lives in the national mode. Or to put it another way, I think that a history of the everyday has to begin with how people went through their daily lives, rather than by imposing a national framework onto them. And sort of finally, inspired as I was as a graduate student by Prasenja Dwar's call for alternative histories, right, rescuing history from the nation, I went into the project with a really open mind about the sorts of identities I might uncover, and that is where I'm going to head now. So with all of that background, I want readers to come away from this book with a greater awareness and appreciation for the complexities of Taiwanese identities, and of how nested or overlapping identities produce and undermine each other. And more specifically, I hope that readers will come to accept my arguments that local and ethnic identities emerged in Keelung and other parts of Taiwan in their own right, rather than just as sprouts of a later or a contemporaneous Taiwanese nationalism. There's certainly connections between all these identities, and I'll make some comments on that later, but I'm also arguing for the autonomy of an ethnicity and the autonomy of a local identity. And so now let me turn to those two identities, beginning with the local. In writing the history of Keelung, one of the first realities that impressed itself upon me and that confronted me was the really rapid construction and expansion from a collection of villages into a real genuine city from the 1890s into the 1920s. And that same process was really true also for Kaohsiung, for Taichung, and to maybe a lesser extent for Taipei, but there as well. I was convinced at an early stage of the project by someone who might be in the audience tonight, Georgia Mickey, that maybe there was a more interesting story underlying this physical construction than just the construction itself. And so I went looking for that more interesting story. And I started to find it, I think, in the emergence of a local ethos pretty early in the 20th century, or a sense of local civic boosterism. Initially, I found this in the actions and the ideas or the comments of some of the Japanese settlers, who really saw themselves in the role of bringing modern Japanese civilization to Taiwan, largely in the form of urbanization and urban development. But this local identity, or this local ethos, was rapidly embraced by the native elites. In fact, I think they very definitely created that local identity. Right? These were men who were steeped in late Qing traditions of elite activism. And they really performed that role with vigor, especially as they linked that old form to new roles as leaders of capitalist corporations or leaders of social welfare projects and cultural reform projects. So these local elites developed Keelung identity largely through efforts to build organizations that supported society, that promoted the city within Taiwan, but also in other parts of the Japanese Empire, and also gave themselves a platform from which they could try to plan the city's future. But Keelung identity was not the same thing to all of these elites, right? They saw the city and their roles in it through different lenses. And that divergence, or these different lenses, definitely overlapped with ancestry, and especially with the policies of the governing regimes in Taiwan and with the ideologies of Japanese and Chinese nationalism. And that overlap brings me to the ethnic identity, or the ethnogenesis of the book's title. Because there was no such thing as Taiwanese identity before the beginnings of Japanese colonization. At least I haven't seen sufficient evidence of such a thing. What had happened among settlers from China prior to 1895 was identity formation in 3 dimensions: against the indigenous populations, toward the Qing state, and also toward the localities within which they settled in Taiwan. But after 1895, the Japanese colonial regime and Japanese settlers approached that at least semi-nativized population as if it were an ethnic group. They defined these locals in demographic terms or through specific policies as a collectivity. And they based that definition of this collectivity upon cultural matter that was largely imported from China, but which they viewed as particular to this collectivity of islanders. Right? They defined things such as language, religion, marital customs, foot binding, queue wearing, opium smoking, all as features of islanders' culture or of Taiwan's culture. In fact, Japanese imperialist ideology was predicated on 3 overlapping ideas, perhaps. One of common race, Pan-Asianism, a second of multiple ethnicity, and then a third of a single nationality, right? To those outside of the empire, everybody was considered Japanese with gradations within that. Hence, right, the ethnicization of the peoples of Taiwan. But when the government general of Taiwan sought to control, and then particularly in the late 1930s, mid-late 1930s, eradicate things like local temples and their festivals, or the use of Hokkien in daily life and written Chinese in many platforms, and tried to reorient social work so that it would serve functions of social control. The islanders, the Taiwanese, defended these parts of their everyday lives even more strongly than they had in the preceding decades. And that process was largely repeated after 1945, when the new KMT regime also ethnicized the Taiwanese and targeted essentially the same realms of daily life for reform and suppression. But this Taiwanese ethnic identity was not simply a form of defensive anti-colonialism. It was that, but it wasn't only that. Because over several decades prior to the 1930s, the islanders had engaged in really proactive processes of community building through a range of organizations and activities that connected them to each other within Geelong and also across Taiwan. And then these organizations helped to mediate between sort of the majority of Taiwan's population and the colonial state. I use the term gatekeepers throughout the book. So these individual elites and their organizations were really gatekeepers between the colonial state and Japanese settlers, and then the KMT state and the new mainlander settlers, and the islander Taiwanese populations. Now, you may be asking fairly, why I say that this was not nationalism, right? Why it was not national construction. When other scholars have shown that that identity was definitely in operation in Taiwan in the 20s and 30s and after. Well, partly I argue for this as an ethnic identity, as ethnogenesis, because again, in this local everyday context that I was studying, there was no really overt evidence of anti-Japanese independence activities. Of course, an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as we all know. So a more substantial reason, I think, why I see this as ethnogenesis is that all of the resistance to and rejection of state policies and settler activities that I talk about at great length in the book took place within a context of general acceptance of the current regime that governed Taiwan. And I think that to interpret that resistance and rejection as nationalism would require accepting the teleology of the nation state in all cases. What I will say, and I'm happy to talk about this ethnic national relationship more in Q&A, but what I will say now is that once this ethnicity was created, it was available for later generations to build upon as they created new versions of Taiwanese nationalism in later decades, particularly after the end of martial law. And that brings me finally to this last section, which is the shortest. So we're almost finished with me and to our comments. This is, I would want people to come away with a sense and the tools, a sense of and the tools to carry out a rethinking of Taiwan in order to make it more relevant in larger academic and popular discussions. Right, until a relatively recent and very gratifying explosion of scholarship on Taiwan as Taiwan, it had long been presented as a peripheral piece of something else. It was China's island frontier. It was Japan's colonial outpost, or it was free China. And these prevailing trends were, as I said earlier, unsatisfying to me. How could a place that had a history that was so much unlike that of both 20th century China and 20th century Japan be addressed only from the perspective of these metropolitan cores? And so to sort of promote this study of Taiwan in its own right, I had to break out of those metropolitan-centered frameworks. And I also had to break away from some long-established chronologies of Taiwan's history. There are a number of these chronologies, but the prevailing ones, I think, sort of divide things up at 1684 to 1895, 1895 to 1945, 1945 to 1987, and then 1987 up to the present. These are all regime defined, right? These are all defined by the government, the regime that is governing the island. And I thought that to center the people, right, I need to move beyond that. With my emphasis on the everyday, the residents of Geelong lived across the 1895 and 1945 divides. And since I was prioritizing their experiences over the states that made those divisions, I also had to transcend those temporal boundaries. And I talk about this at much greater length in an essay in the International Journal of Taiwan Studies from 2018. So if you're really interested, I can point you in that direction. The last thing that I'll say here is that taking Taiwan on its own terms, I think allows it to be more easily incorporated into comparative frameworks and also into global and transnational histories that look at phenomena rather than places, that use places to investigate particular phenomena, but it's still the phenomena that matter. And I think that if Taiwan is taken as Taiwan, it's easier to use it in those frameworks. And again, small plug, James Lin and I and a small group of collaborators made a much more detailed case for this in an essay on teaching Taiwan that was in the American Journal of Chinese Studies just last year. But that teaching process can also extend, I think, to research agendas as well. So those are all of the things that I would really want readers to come away from the book with. And that is where I will end. I've said enough and I'm really excited now to listen. So thank you.
Thank you, Evan. And then especially there's 3 different dimensions of the book that, we can definitely talk more in the Q&A section. So now I will pass the time to Professor Liao for comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Like Evan, I'd also like to thank everybody, especially the center, for organizing this event. I think Evan's book is remarkable in filling the gaps provided by books like Antonio Andrade's Last Colony, in which he argues about why Taiwan actually became Chinese. because of Qing Empire's intervention and lots of the way Koxinga defeated Dutch, and in all kinds of way also push away the Spanish forces in Taiwan. So this is very, very important kinds of 17th century ideas about how Taiwan got incorporated into China. And this is very increasingly becoming a major problem in Taiwan studies. Is Taiwan part of China? This is very, very important. And I think in the other extreme, Melissa Brown's book on the Austronesian population in Taiwan, dating back all the prehistorical period, and increasingly more and more South Asian immigrants and guest workers and interracial marriages in Taiwan actually transforming Taiwanese national identity in all kinds of ways. So lots of ways, I think Professor Evan Dawley's book actually respond to this kinds of question. Is Taiwan part of China? In response to Andrade's book about transnational and transregional historical contingencies, because of Koxinga losing his dynasty, the Ming dynasty, he tried to resuscitate a Chinese tradition, and David Wang and lots of others actually argue for these kinds of Chinese cultural heritage. And this is the way that Chiang Kai-shek later on also tried to re-signify Taiwan in terms of using Taiwan as the bastion to reclaim mainland China. So that's the way that with lots of these kinds of historical background in the way we talk about Taiwan in social, economic, and cultural history. And lots of controversies in terms of all kinds of contingencies and all kinds of desire to claim Taiwan to be independent. And this is very, very difficult situation when you have historical situation in confrontation with political demand, and increasingly because of the new Cold War. Right now, China actually sending fighter jets practically every day, sometimes even more than 2,000 to Taiwan, to threaten Taiwan and to claim Taiwan to be the renegade province in all kinds of ways, try to reunify. So this is increasingly, I think, when we are teaching Taiwan, for instance, I am teaching Taiwan films at UCSD. Every time we need to deal with these kinds of problem, especially lots of the students are from Hong Kong, Singapore, and mostly from China. They always ask the question, is Taiwan part of China? So I think this is very, very important in the way that, in terms of the way that Evan's book actually respond to Melissa Brown's ideas about Taiwan actually very Taiwanese, not that Chinese. Whereas 17th century on, we have lots of his historical situation in all kinds of ways, implying that implicating Taiwan as because of Qing Empire's intervention into the frontier consciousness. So we have Emma Deng and Tonio Andrade and lots of books on this source. And this is very, very contingent and transregional, very, very interesting and very complicated issue. And I think Evan's wonderful book actually tried to unpack, focusing on Keelung as a port city in terms of social history, everyday life, how the local elites collaborated with Japanese businessmen, administrators in the way that they try to build the mega city, Keelung, in terms of population. More than a quarter of the demographic figure actually show that 20 to 25% of the residents actually Japanese. So lots of these kinds of way that ethnicity and interracial, that kinds of prosperity, that kinds of desire, common experience in terms of the way that they work together. And I think Evan actually very, very interestingly raised the questions about when and by whom that we have these kinds of urban identity around Keelung constructed because of all kinds of desire and common experience that they share, both Chinese in Taiwan, in terms of the early Chinese migrants to Taiwan. They actually, and this is very much the influence of Philip Kuhn. I think lots of ways that we see Bill Kirby's ideas about economic and social history in the project that Evan tried to put together here, and also Chinese migrants in Taiwan in the way that's from 17th century on. We have Horo, Hakka in competition and often in all kinds of conflict with the Aboriginal populations in Taiwan. And this is very much, I think, in the way that after 1890s, I think this is very much the focus, 1890s to 1950s, in the way that Keelung got, in all kinds of ways, zoom in this wonderful book, in the way that we have the third largest city in Taiwan at the time. Suddenly, we have all these kinds of culture elites, very much in the way that they do business. They are also representing the Buddhist association and all kinds of moral societies. And you can see the influence of Dawley here, Pasenji Dawley's ideas about rescuing history from the nation in the way that lots of ways that Mazu cult in Taiwan, actually Mazu was brought from Zhangzhou from China to Taiwan, but actually it became so, in all kinds of ways, visible and so integrated into Taiwanese culture in terms of welfare program. And this is, I think, lots of ways that we have all these Chinese migrants teaming up with all kinds of corridor and all kinds of pathways, gateways that they put together. And this is how they define themselves as no longer just Chinese, because the way they settle down and they try to organize around their religious activities, festivals, and also in memory of the dead, in the way they have ghost festivals, and in the way that they try to build a city, try to modernize and urbanize, and in all kinds of ways, try to do trade more effectively than those back home in China. So this very, very important book actually teases out all these kinds of very, very unique trajectory that Keelung's residents actually cultivate their very, very, not just Japanese or Chinese identities, because of the way cultural heritage and also colonial policy of assimilation. They also try to struggle, renegotiate, and redefine themselves as not just Japanese or not just Chinese, even though they are very much influenced by Japanese in all kinds of infrastructure building, all kinds of colonial modernity projects in Taiwan, or they are also constantly worshiping all kinds of Chinese deities like Mazu or Jigong or Buddha in all kinds of ways. In all kinds of ways, the use of their everyday experience and the cults, icons, and the way they cultivate their organizations, very much like all kinds of association or welfare fraternity clubs and all kinds of programs that they put together that actually try to, in all kinds of ways, show that they are actually taking in more new urban experiences in terms of the way they modernize themselves in not only using Liu-Ping Chen's idea from Qing Dynasty, but also very much reenacted by the Japanese in Taiwan because of colonial government's projects in Taiwan, building up railroads, and in the way that the light rail project in Keelung put together by the Japanese and Taiwanese. So Yan brothers, and the way that we have lots of people who are actually the local elites, very much so. I think in the book, actually, Xi Zisang, Mr. Xu constantly stands out as a person doing multiple jobs. This is a person of multiple tasks in the way, not only running business, but also religious organizations and putting together all kinds of charity and all kinds of network, but also moving Taiwan toward election, democracy, and in all kinds of way, in collaboration, everything possible, making Keelung residents actually more flexible and more easily exposed to all kinds of transnational cultures, forces, or in the way that we talk about global cultural economy, all kinds of information. And this is very much in the way that I think newspapers, popular fiction, and film, in all kinds of ways. I think this is very, very much, when I was teaching courses at UCSD, normally we will be using these kinds of materials, documentaries, and lots of these kinds of visual culture, and all kinds of popular fiction, 369, popular fiction published in the newspaper. Only every month you have the number 3, number 6, and number 9. Those days you would have these kinds of popular fiction, and that in all kinds of ways making modern girls in Taiwan so exposed to feminism, popular music, especially American jazz, and lots of ways, a new technology. So this is very, very different from the modern girls in Shanghai. And this is the way that I think the emphasis, I think, in the book on everyday life, around life and work of these local elites, in the way that they collaborate. And sometimes they also fight, struggle in terms of their own self-interest and their, in all kinds of cultural heritage. They try to negotiate with their Japanese friends and colonial regime in all kinds of ways. That this is, I think, in the book, lots of these kinds of places where Professor Dawley talks about certain kinds of superficial kinds of way, paying lip service to the Japanese by maintaining all kinds of space, internal, and this is the way we talk about subjectivity, internal way that Keelung residents actually try to cultivate, try to develop these kinds of tactics in the way they try to survive and try to define that they are actually constantly negotiating with colonial powers. And this is the way I think very, very important in the way that we have all these chapters talking about urbanity, modernity, and religious kinds of practice in the everyday life, in engaging in the way that Taiwanese in Keelung, actually, mostly I think Professor Dawley actually talking about Milanese, the so-called 扶老客, or Hokro, actually the Milanese, or the majority ethnic group, not so much in terms of Hakka or the Aborigine in Keelung or in the peripheral areas, especially some islands, like some islands actually occupied by the Aboriginal Basai for instance, in island of peace, 和平岛. Lots of ways. I think this is very, very important in the way that Professor Dawley tried to develop these kinds of ideas around ethnicity and urbanity, modernity, and also secular kinds of religion in the way that they organize all kinds of welfare and modern science or global health program in terms of cutting your hair and stop that kinds of bad practice of binding women's feet, and in all kinds of ways get more attention to public hygiene. And this is very important in the way that I think in the book, actually, lots of the earlier part actually deal with all these kinds of colonial modernity in the way it's absorbed and make more flexible. And Taiwanese becoming more and more adaptive and in all kinds of ways, not just one, but many in the way that develop these kinds of channels to get exposed to Japanese colonial modernity in Keelung. And this is very, very successful, especially Keelung as a port city, having all kinds of way to, it's kinds of gateway to trade and to the outside world in all kinds of ways. So this is also very, very important in the way that Keelung was picked because of Keelung's very, very special location, and also Danshui not that fortunate. So Professor Dawley actually talks about how Keelung was picked and then cultivated as a major port city in the north. And this is in all kinds of ways, putting these kinds of place and identity formation in these kinds of very, very wonderful geopolitical situation of urban projects and modernity and new science project in Taiwan by the Japanese. And in contrast to that, later on when KMT came over to Taiwan, this is, I think the book ends with February 28th and all kinds of recovery and re-sanification, all kinds of projects that in contrast to the Japanese, Chinese, KMT actually try to build Keelung, but this is also a major site for massacre, especially 和平岛. This is the first island when Chinese army landed, and this is creating all kinds of misunderstanding and chaos. So this is the aftermath of February 28th. And this is the beginning of new terror, white terror, and all kinds of ways. The book concludes with this kinds of comparison, but in all kinds of ways, I think the major argument made by Professor Dawley is about this kinds of ethnic identity formation in terms of religion, organizational culture, business, and colonial modernity projects, but not in terms of nationalism, because this is a very, very major argument made by Evan in the way that the book shies away from the kinds of national identity construction in the way using Taiwan as a state. We all know this is also, I think, in all kinds of ways that we are talking, I think, Evan earlier talks about the way that we constantly talk about modern history in relation to nation state. Taiwan happens to be a very unique case of a state without nationhood. It's not recognized as a nation, even though it has its own army, police. It's run like a state. And this is very, very crucial in all kinds of scholarships around Taiwan in relation to China, to US, and in all kinds of ways. So this is very, very important. I think in this very, very important book, actually, Professor Dawley tried to make that kinds of claim that we are more focused on the place, Keelung, as a port city, and in terms of this kinds of ethnicity, but not in terms of national identity building, because we have lots of historical contingency forces there, making Taiwanese actually more exposed to Japanese culture because of colonialism. And also at the same time, they also struggle with their Chinese heritage. And later on, because of KNT, kinds of February 28th and its aftermath in Taiwan, lots of situation. It's until 1970s. Then we have the opposition party and the beginning of a new democratic movement in Taiwan. Suddenly we have more and more kinds of localization movement. Taiwan becoming more and more Taiwanese in terms of political identity and national identity. And that's the way the cultural memory get mobilized in all kinds of ways. So I think this is very, very wonderful that the book actually ends with this kinds of comparative frameworks. First, Japanese, and then KMT Chinese in Taiwan in relation to the port city, how the mega city actually get built and then rebuilt. And this is very, very important book in the way that in response to all kinds of projects on maritime Taiwan. And also, if we can actually say that Taiwan actually will be becoming independent, then this is very much in the way that I think the book poses all kinds of very, very intriguing data and historical facts against that kinds of very, very simplistic argument. And I have my PowerPoint here, probably because running, I think I've been using too much time. But perhaps I can show the PowerPoint. I have some questions for Professor Dawley. I mean, this is very, very important. I enjoy reading that very much. But I think in the way that we have who were the Taiwanese, when and by whom, how was the identity constructed? This is a very, very important issue raised by Professor Dawley. So the book focuses on ethnic, non-national, urban, organizational, religious, everyday life in relation to how Taiwanese actually negotiate their identity in response to the state-driven projects. And this is how Taiwanese actually in all kinds of ways, develop their identity in between the Chinese and the Japanese. But the book very much focuses on local elites and in the way they negotiate colonial modernity. So we have Xi Zhisang, Yuan brothers, Yuan Guonian, and their Japanese friends, Omi, and lots of these kinds of very, very wonderful public sphere and welfare programs, religious cause around Mazu, for instance, or city guards. So can we the next slide? So I have questions about the agency here as raised in the book. Sometimes we have some questions about islanders and ethnic minorities. I think, and this is how my PowerPoint would conclude with some smaller islands near the port city. Lots of the small islands actually supposed to be islanders, and they are Basai and Ping-hui. Lots of aboriginal populations, but this is not highlighted. And sometimes I think Professor Dawley tend to think of islanders as a homogeneous kinds of ethnic group. And this is very much hello, the Vietnamese mostly that he's talking about in the book. And the other is how effective is modernizing, civilizing the local. And this is the issue that I like to raise about popular fiction in the way that lots of new literature and new documentaries, and this is how in my courses on Taiwan film, we constantly use music and poetry as a way to show that Taiwanese actually try to cultivate their very vernacular, but also very, very cosmopolitan, not limited to Japanese or Chinese, because in music industry, lots of American, European influence, French Impressionism, modern music from Europe, actually playing very, very vital role in the formation of Taiwanese identity. So I talk about these kinds of retailization, how you can actually create these kinds of external space. Or, and I think Professor Dawley also mentioned that there's all kinds of alternatives, that this is very, very important in the way that when we see some documentaries and certain kinds of pulp fictions in this period, we see lots of new kinds of subaltern, kinds of new ideas from the bottom. People, popular fiction, and readers actually contribute to the making of the sense of Taiwanese consciousness. And this is not limited to those collaboration projects launched by the local elites. So my question is about the boundaries, how we can actually draw the boundaries and sacred spaces, especially Mazu cult in Keelung, very, very crucial. I think not only as in terms of pilgrimage, Mazu actually very, very much organized in all kinds of alternative space in Taiwan's religious practice in the formation of Taiwanese identity, very different from the way that you have back home in Zhangzhou or in China. And this is how I think lots of ways, gender and the alternative way of religious practice actually very, very crucial in the making of Taiwanese identity. So we have religious festivals, welfare programs in the public sphere. And I'd like to raise the questions about the subaltern space in the way lots of public sphere, popular culture, pop fiction, and music created by the local, especially around Ximending and lots of places in northern China. Actually, we have a film, Viva Tono, in the way that recording all kinds of new music in Taiwan. And they are actually traditional Chinese music, but also kinds of new lyrics and new music created by the subaltern. And this is very, very important. And this is how Viva Tono actually talks about how Taiwanese music actually got disseminated across the world, especially all the way to Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and back home to Macau and Xiamen, creating very, very different kinds of way that, and this is, I think, a memorable name would be like Deng Lijun, Emma Deng, for instance, in all kinds of way, showing what kinds of melody Taiwanese actually created this kinds of way that actually not just Chinese, it's also very, very influential in the 1980s China to talk about emotion and sentiments and in all kinds of ways, subjectivity, selfhood. So this is very, very important, I think, in the way that I try to suggest that in my writing, in my courses at UCSD, we try to talk about different ways that there's other kinds of subaltern out of survival and accommodation or kinds of readjustments of their identities in all kinds of ways. Can we move on to the next slide, maybe? Yeah, I think in the last slide, I show the the windmill poet society, and also the music industry in 1920s and 30s in Taiwan, as documented by 3 directors in the film Viva Tono. Lots of ways we can sense that lots of these kinds of Taiwanese identity having all kinds of multiple channels and new technologies. So it's very, very gendered and also global in all kinds of ways. So I like to end with these comments about this is sunrise on an island. This is very, very, because we just have Mid-Autumn Festival. So the photographer said this rising sun actually very much like a mooncake. And this also in red, but this is, I like to remind people that actually the recovery of Taiwan, especially Keelung's Peace Island, actually named by the KMT, because of this kind of Chinese culture orientation. You need to be in all kinds of ways, constantly think about the 3 names as totally Chinese. So this is how they use A virtues to rename all the city streets, corners, and so on and so forth. And this is very much in the way that February 28th, actually, the massacre happened on a very, very bloody island, and now it's renamed Heping Dao, Peace Island. And this is some kinds of irony. And this is something that probably we need to be developing that kinds of more complicated and contingent, but also ironic, very, very ironic view about what actually happened in Keelung, in the city or on the periphery. The outside, on those islands, we have lots of these kinds of Aboriginal people, and they actually colonized and recolonized and also purged and massacred by the colonial governments, Chinese or Japanese. So I like to end my comment here. I think I like the book very much. It's just the way that I think probably more diversified kinds of sighting of the city, and also in terms of the Aboriginal and the subaltern kinds of contributions to the making of the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Liao, for this very rich comments, and also this very broad historical context of Taiwan as an island, and also different movement and also cultural practice, various and diverse cultural practice and linguistic aspect of the island. So now I was wondering whether, Evan, you would like to quickly respond to the comment. I know it's an impossible task because it's really rich, and I know that there are many moments and then many points that definitely we would like to explore with you. But maybe out of those very wonderful points, maybe if you can choose 1 or 2 to briefly address it, and maybe we can move to Q&A around 5-10-ish.
Sure.
Okay.
I will try to go as quickly as I can here. But as you say, Li-Ping, there's so much richness in those comments, and I'm really quite grateful for both the care that you took to go through the book, and then also to think about, well, and then to comment on, well, where is it sort of falling short? Where is it not quite making its arguments? And what then could be points of departure for future research, whether by me or others. So let me see if I can, well, let me respond first to your comment in the slide and your question about or around the presence of indigenous, the Hoklo-centric nature of my study, right? That there were the Minnonese from Zhangzhou, Quanzhou that were in Keelung rather than Hakka, and those are Those are really good points. I mean, I would absolutely agree that the group of people who I'm talking about, who I researched and in whom I am seeding this Taiwanese identity and I'm citing as sort of the creators of this Taiwanese ethnicity, they had a very particular origin, and their experience was not the experience of everyone in Taiwan during the Japanese period or immediately after. Certainly, in regards to the indigenous in particular, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, happened in the Qing period. There was a process of identity formation against the indigenous, and I think that continued in the Japanese era. Certainly, that as this ethnic identity took shape, it was done very much at the exclusion of indigenous identity. One of the intriguing details for me is actually about the Mazu cult that helped to establish itself in Geelong because of an association with soldiers who were victorious over indigenous resistance in the Hualien region in around 1918 or so. So right, there was a way, I mean, a clear sense in which that ethnic identity was formed against indigenous populations. In terms of Hakka and also in terms of indigenous, as you mentioned a few times, Professor Liao, that the urban setting was so important for these modern processes. And in Geelong, in particular, maybe, that urban population was primarily, almost exclusively, Zhangzhou Quanzhou descendants. And so, because it was in the city, and cities plural, that these modernization processes were taking place, that the relations with Japanese settlers that I think were so important to give context for new identities to form, that it really was that specific subset of Taiwan's population that created this identity. So it did not include everybody. It certainly did not. But it was framed, I think, as inclusive. And that is, you know, to some extent, the privilege of the formers, right? They get to frame their identity as inclusive as they see fit in this case. But I guess the last thing that I'll say on these divisions between Chinese descendants is that those divisions had, of course, been very intense in the Qing period, very intense in the Qing period, whether it was Zhangzhou Quanzhou, whether it was Hoklo Hakka. But in the last decades of the Qing period, those tensions began to subside in the context of economic development. And I think that under the Japanese, which classified them all as Hontojin, Bandaren, or islanders, that provided at least the opportunity for these urban dwelling Hoklo to conceive of a more unified or broader Taiwanese identity. Whether or not that identity was accepted, I think subsequent developments would suggest, or with the re-emergence of these separate identities in the 50s and 60s and after, that it was not all that effective a process. But that was the envisioning. I think I covered a few of your comments in there as well. Perhaps we can turn things to other questions
I was, of course, yes. Thank you, Evan, for the response, because I was also thinking about some of the Professor Liao's comments also in relation to the other questions as well. And yeah, you have
actually, sorry, I mean, I didn't want to miss, even though I don't have a good answer, I didn't want to miss your final point about these and your well sort of expressed, extensively expressed point about the subaltern spaces. The different cultural aspects. The reason I don't have a good answer is that was a feature that I just didn't really get into in my research. But I have sort of stacks of Taiwan Nichi Nichi Shinpo and the Niitaka Shinpo articles that do actually talk about some of these things, particularly in terms of cafe society, literature. That was, I think that I did inadvertently come across some of these stories that you were talking about published on the 3rd, 6th, and 9th that I just didn't get to. But
that sounds like a great next book project.
Yeah. Yeah, I would hope that would add richness though, rather than dissolve the overall arguments. But that remains to be seen. So thank you very much. And maybe we can turn to some other questions.
Awesome. So I believe in your response, you mentioned a little bit about in response to some of the questions actually submitted earlier, for example, the Japanese colonial governance and also the indigenous communities. So let's turn to the question actually submitted by our audience here with us. That's we have a question from Yan Lu, and I believe it's about the Geelong as a case study for you. And the second question is about localization, and especially in terms of religious practice and also cultural practice. So let me read the question. Evan, you can also, if you would like to read, it's also in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm happy to read it. So right. Specifically regarding the Mazu cult, maybe I'll take that one. A southern Chinese practice from Fujian has been recognized as a marker for overseas Chinese population in Southeast Asia countries and societies. How did it become non-Chinese marker in Taiwan? That is a really fascinating question, and the answer, I mean, has a lot to do with context and the specific ways. Let's see. The specific importance that Mazu had already taken on, I think, for populations in Taiwan by 1895, and held for the Fujianese who settled in Taiwan. But then it really was the circumstances of Japanese colonization in particular that allowed for first a flourishing of Mazu worship in Taiwan, right? The early colonial policies towards religion, towards Taiwan's religions, really allowed, after an initial suppression period, allowed these territorial cults to flourish, whether it was Mazu or other deities. And so that, I think, intensified the affiliation between the people in Geelong and other parts of Taiwan and these deities, and so made them more central pieces of the identity. And then the attack on those that came in the 1930s with a temple regulation movement that tried to shut down Mazu temples and tried to control the annual Mazu festivals. I think that provoked a defensive response that then again intensified the competition. The final piece, and this is why going to the post-war period is so important, I think, is that once again, the KMT regime targeted Mazu worship, targeted aspects at least of Mazu worship as being superstitious and uncivilized. And so this was coming from a Chinese government. And so that really highlighted, I think, the distinction between what Chinese national identity was and what identities in Taiwan had taken shape around. So that's my answer to that. Very quickly, Geelong is a stand-in for all of Taiwan. I guess that's sort of essentially my answer to the importance of the urban settings It's not a stand-in for all of Taiwan, but it is a stand-in for the places where these processes of modernization were going on, and those processes promoted new forms of identity.
Sounds good. And especially Geelong, not just as a port, but also port city, right? So there's a people living there. And as you mentioned, Evan, this kind of everyday moment that in our understanding of Taiwan alternatively. So now we actually have a next question is actually for Professor Liao, and especially during Professor Liao, your comment, you mentioned several film, and then our audience would like to know one of the title that is something tunnel. So if you can share with us about the title of the film, that would be great.
I had that in the third slide. I think that's Viva Tunnel. This is kind of interesting. This is Columbia record label, just devoted to recording Taiwanese music, especially old and new music. And this is the Columbia label, actually, Viva Tunnel, actually, this is the first hi-fi. This is stereo sound made in US. And this is Columbia issued that as the first label of hi-fi, high fidelity, but it didn't survive in US. The only place it survived actually was in Taipei because of a Japanese kind of music industry manager tried to use this label and try to produce all the old and new music in Taiwan. And because of all kinds of overseas interests, lots of market at the time. So this is a documentary trying to suggest how the musicians actually make that kinds of music and how this kinds of label actually attains success, especially in Southeast Asia and overseas markets. So this is a very, very interesting kinds of cultural history on the everyday life of music makers and those people who are actually working with the Japanese boss for that record company.
Sounds good. Thank you, Professor Liao. And then Alex, would you mind copy and paste the title from Professor Liao's slides and share it in the chat with our audience? All right, cool. So next we're moving on to next two questions, and I think they are related in some way in terms of the alternative model and framework that Evan you choose for this book. So first is from January 10, and especially about this non-national approach that you have in examining the local in contrast to the transnational approach that might seek to go beyond the nation state in the broader or more micro perspective in terms of examining the economic networks, diasporic connection, etc. So the question is, how does the picture of Taiwan change when we focus on one city instead of the island, Taiwan, as a player in the global and international system? And I believe this question is also related to Professor Brian Bernard's question about maritime culture, and then also especially Geelong as a port city, and then this maritime connection, oceanic framework, and how does that shape the identity and also the culture in the city?
These are great questions, and they remind me of where I was at the beginning of this project, because I really was thinking at an early stage that okay, so what was important about Geelong? It was a trade port. It was the most important port city in terms of trade volume for almost all of the Japanese period, and then once again in the early post-war years. Kaohsiung sort of overtook it, at least as an export port in the late I think in the 1940s, and then again overtook Geelong in the late 1950s after it had rebuilt. But so I was really looking at an early stage at the Japanese shipping companies that really developed the trade lines that primarily went between Osaka and Geelong, but also connected places like Shanghai, or went on even to Europe, to North America. And then as I just dug into the local study, I couldn't do both. I had to sacrifice that broad global framework. And so I'm sure that I missed out on ways of situating Geelong within broader cosmopolitan histories, or histories of cosmopolitanism, histories of diasporic connections, right? I mean, as Taiwanese went out during the Japanese period, where did they go? I believe that some of them had Geelong connections, but I wasn't really able to explore that. I have it on good authority, actually, that there were a number of Geelong merchants who ended up in Kobe for a while, and maybe and also down in Southeast Asia. But I just was not able to pull those threads. I had to end up focusing much more tightly on the local. But with an awareness that local was as a port, right? Since it was a port city, as Li-Ping has reminded us, it only emerged and became subject to these modernizing processes because it was embedded in these broader networks. And so that's not maybe a very satisfying answer to the questions that had a lot more substance to them that I unfortunately can't really provide in my answer.
It sounds like it's a great next book project, and then this Becoming Taiwanese, this book already spark a lot of conversation and also exploration in different trajectories and also a different dimension of Taiwan, and especially the colonial governance and also the colonial period as well. So let me take
Can I just say, let me say one thing,
sure.
sorry, as I'm looking at the last question, right? What impact, was there a culture of oceanic transit at this time? And what impact did it have in shaping the specific cultural milieu of Geelong? So I'm thinking here of the wonderful collection of postcards at Lafayette College that Paul Barclay has been putting together over a number of years, because there are a lot of those postcards that have most of the picture, a large percentage of the pictures, postcards that are of Geelong are of the port, of the harbor, with large ocean-going vessels moored there. So I think, yes, there was some sense of an oceanic culture that made Geelong particular, that made it special, and that certainly the Japanese wanted to present it as this harbor that people came to. There's a great line in the harbor, the Geelong City song, that talks about it as an important harbor on world trade routes, essentially. So there was a little bit of that. Now that I've been prodded to dredge up those details.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. And we have one more message in the Q&A box. It's from Ji Hee Kim, and then especially about this network. And the network in this kind of maritime East Asia. And then there are some Koreans that actually come to Taiwan for work, and then Geelong is maybe their first stop and their first experience of Taiwan, actually. So this is the message to sort of add into that oceanic connection of Taiwan, and also specifically Geelong.
Yeah. Those intra-colonial or those trans-colonial connections, I think, are well worth exploring. Again, it's sort of the Koreans who came to Geelong sort of showed up in bits of data that I came across here and there, but I couldn't locate enough information on their presence in the city to really go much further with that. I have some interesting research on that who knows if it'll ever see the light of day, but on region-wide social work conferences that took place in Japan that brought together social workers from around the empire. And I think there are some also interesting trans-colonial connections there that could be made.
Yeah, and then especially this kind of inter-colonies as well,
Yeah.
back in the colonial time. So let me see, with that note, so this is a wonderful book talk and very productive conversation as well. And then especially thinking about, as Professor Liao mentioned, we have Tony Andre's How Taiwan Became Chinese. And then later on, we have Leo Chin's Becoming Japanese. And now we have you, Evan, your book, Becoming Taiwanese. So in this way, we see that at least from these three books that I just mentioned, there's kind of like a process or processes that the transformation and formation of the Taiwanese identity that is actually in motion, and then still in it's a very dynamic and organic formation. So with that, thank you, Professor Dawley, for sharing your work with us, and then also Professor Liao for very rich and insightful comments. And thank you, our audience, for joining us today from different places of the world and sharing your questions and feedback with us. So remember to check out our event page for other book talk in the series, and also many other upcoming events hosted by EASC. So I hope you guys all stay safe and see you in our next event. Take care.
Thank you all very much.